In this episode of Bonsai-U, we're going to be talking about everything related to double flush pines. I'm going to walk you through a maintenance schedule that starts in the spring, goes through summer pruning techniques, followed by what to do in the fall, and then we're going to talk about how to overwinter these species. Now, first and foremost, before we dive into this, we need to define what a double flush pine is. What double flush refers to is pine species that can be decandled in the summer, meaning the first flush of growth can be completely removed from the tree, and then a secondary flush of growth can then be induced on a consistent basis. So there are only a handful of pines that fall into this category, or at least so far with our experimentation around the world, we know of only a handful. So first and foremost, the number one and most popular, I would say, would be the Japanese black pine. Second would be the Japanese red pine. Third, we have the pitch pine here in the United States, as well as the shortleaf pine or yellow pine. And then we also have the loblolly pine, which I personally haven't worked with, but many in the southeast and further south claim is a great double flush pine. And then in Europe and the Middle East, we have the Aleppo pine. So this handful of pine species really are all we know of so far as being true double flush pines. Now, there are some other pine species that can be decandled with mixed results. So for example, here in the United States, there's also the Virginia pine, but because that tree or that species does not produce a consistent secondary flush of growth each year when it's decandled, I would not put that into the double flush pine category. Now, what's interesting about all of these double flush pine species is that they all grow in relatively warm and somewhat humid environments, with of course the exception of the Aleppo pine, which grows in the desert in many areas. But in any case, they're all growing in very warm environments, meaning that they've got very long growing seasons, which means that there's the potential for an extra long period of time after the decandling process for that secondary set of growth to come out and harden off. Now, why are these particular pines double flush? I would imagine it has to do with the evolutionary background of these species in a given region. So for example, there needs to be some sort of outside stimuli or stimulus that is going to cause the candles to be removed from the tree in nature and then the secondary flush to be induced. So if we take a look at, let's say, the Japanese black pine, for example, these trees are coastal trees in Japan. Quite often during the late summer, you'll end up with typhoons and massive winds coming through. A lot of the foliage gets damaged on the pines at that time of year, and then a secondary flush is induced after that. If we look at some of the pines here in the United States, for example, the pitch pine or the yellow pine, quite often you'll see fires in those areas where it completely wipes out the forest, and then from old wood, you'll actually see new sprouts of growth emerge. So this is particularly true when we're talking about pitch pine. You could potentially cut all of the foliage off, all of the branches off of a pitch pine, and it will backbud from old wood from within the fissures of the wood on the trunk. Now, contrast that to the growing environment and evolutionary background of most of the single flush pines. Those trees typically are much higher elevation trees. So for example, Japanese white pine in Japan grow up in the high elevation areas of Fukushima. You've got Scots pines growing in the Pyrenees in France, for example. And then of course here in the United States, we have the ponderosa pines, the lodgepoles, and the limber pines all growing in the high elevation Rocky Mountains. So this combination of being high elevation and being in an area where it doesn't get nearly as warm as it does in the lower elevation areas means that the growing environment and the growing season is much shorter for those species, meaning that there's not enough time typically for a secondary flush of growth to be induced if the candle growth is removed on those plants. So this is why we have a pretty small set of plant species that fall into the double flush pine category. And what we're going to do next is dive into how to treat these trees starting in the spring season. So first up, let's take a look at repotting double flush pines in spring. Across the board, all of these pine species should be repotted in the early part of spring just as the buds start changing color and swelling. So the color of the bud prior to the swelling in the spring is going to vary depending on the pine species. So for example, Japanese black pines will tend to have a bit more of a grayish color bud in the winter season, whereas the Japanese red pine will have a bit more of a reddish brown bud. But in any case, when those buds start swelling in the spring and start changing color, they'll change to a more consistent kind of greenish color across the board. And this is a good indicator as to when to actually start repotting these trees. Now, in terms of how aggressive you can get with the repotting and root pruning on these trees, my recommendation is, for the most part across the board, to be relatively conservative with the amount of rootage that you actually physically cut off of these pines, because as a double flush pine, if you weaken the tree by overly pruning the roots in the spring, it's going to be difficult later in the summer to perform the decandling techniques that we're going to talk about later. So as a good sort of general guideline, I would avoid cutting more than about 30 to maybe 40% max of the roots off of a pine. And the older the tree is, I would tone that down even more to the 20 to 30% range. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't work out a lot of the old soil within the root system. So I would recommend with most of your pines to make sure that you're taking out a good amount of the old soil, let's say between 40 and 60%, maybe even up to 70% of the old soil, leaving the core or the sheen of the root ball up underneath the trunk intact, possibly aerating that a little bit if it's become too compacted, but mainly removing the soil around the periphery of the root system, typically starting with a root rake and then using a wooden chopstick to work out as much of that soil as possible without damaging the roots. Then from there, you can decide how much of the actual root system you want to cut back, again, using those percentages that I just mentioned. Now, when it comes to soil selection and soil medium that you're going to be using with your double flush pines, I would recommend that for the most part you use a standard mix of 1 part akadama, 1 part pumice, 1 part lava rock, and 1 part kiryu, which is a heavy river sand. Now, if you're living in a very arid environment, you might want to double the amount of akadama or possibly add a little bit more pumice in there as well, because those two components are going to hold a lot more moisture. But if you're living in a normal sort of temperate environment where it's somewhat humid during the summer, that 4 parts where we're dealing with 1 of each of those components is going to be totally perfect for most of your pines. Now, this would be the soil mix and the soil components I would recommend for trees that are in kind of mid stages of development through refinement. But if you're dealing with much younger trees that are in early stages of development where you're just trying to put on a lot of tissue, you can absolutely use a much heavier mix, like a standard potting mix, for example, or peat and river sand would be completely fine as well. It's kind of a standard nursery mix that you'll find at production nurseries around the country in the United States and around the world as well. And that'll allow you to put on a tremendous amount of tissue in a short amount of time. In regards to fertilization in the spring, I would recommend across the board, whether you're dealing with trees in early stages of development or trees that are fully refined, that you go ahead and start heavily fertilizing at the very beginning of spring. Now, plants that are in early development, since we're trying to put on a lot of tissue, I would recommend, as always, using synthetic fertilizers like Osmocote Plus or Miracle-Gro, for example. They're slow release fertilizers that have a very high nitrogen value, which is going to allow you to put on a lot of growth in a very short amount of time. But if we're talking about trees that have moved more into mid stages of development where we've got the primary structure set up and now we're dealing with secondary ramification development, we're kind of slowing the growth down a little bit, I would switch over to organics. I think really the best organic that you can buy would be BioGold. I know it's a little bit expensive, but it works really, really well. It's a tried and true component. Or if you want to use something sourced locally, let's say in Europe, I think Fertipad is a great company to go with, based out of Belgium. It's all organics, it's powder put into little coffee pads that then sit on the soil surface, and that then leaches out into the soil. And I would also be using the same fertilizer components for trees that are in refinement, continuing, into the future, basically every single spring. This is what you want to put onto those trees. Now, unlike dealing with some other plant species, like say junipers, for example, where we're putting on kind of a moderate amount of this fertilizer, with pines, we're trying to pump them up in the early spring so that when it comes time to decandle them in the summer, they're very strong and very healthy. So I would be putting on a bit more of this fertilizer in the early spring than you would, say, with other plant species. So I would say in general, I would look to add at least a third more, maybe 50% more fertilizer to the soil surface in the early spring through the entire spring than I would with other plant species. And in some cases, you may even want to double what you put on to other plant species. But again, the goal is to pump up these trees so that they're very strong and healthy come decandling season in the summer. Next up, let's talk pests and diseases in the spring. So in terms of pests, there really aren't too many issues in the early spring, although I have come across some caterpillars here in the southeast that will actually attack the new candles as they're emerging, typically here kind of in April to early May. What you'll end up finding with those caterpillars is you won't actually see them on the trees, but the new candles at the tips, the needles will start browning, and you'll start to see it very quickly across the whole tree. Well, what those caterpillars do is they burrow into the candle and eat it from the inside out, and it kills the candle. You can actually, as you see the needle start to change, squish the candle and squish the little caterpillar that's in there, and you'll see it ooze out. Pretty disgusting. But you want to make sure that you're treating preemptively for that. So something like here in the States, the Bonai 941 systemic insect control in the first part of spring is a really good thing to put on those trees. If you don't want to spray, you could also use imidacloprid as a granular on the soil surface in the early part of spring so that it takes it up into the tissue and inoculates the tree. And of course, I'm including our fungicide and pesticide sheet, the PDF, below this video so you can re-download that and make sure that you follow along with that. But those type of components in the early spring should take care of those pests. You could also, if you see those pests emerging on the tree, spray with something like malathion. That takes care of them instantaneously, but of course malathion is quite dangerous. So if you can avoid using that, I would recommend not having that in your arsenal if at all possible. Now, when it comes to diseases in the spring, as we know, and speaking about many other species here on the Bonsai-U platform, spring is one of the worst seasons for disease as temperatures get up to about 45 degrees Fahrenheit or higher, which is going to be around like 5 or 6 degrees Celsius. All of the diseases start blooming at this time of year. Now, some of those diseases won't manifest on the tree until later in the summer, but you need to go ahead and spray now preventively so that you don't see that emerge on the foliage later in the year. So for example, things like needle blight and needle cast, you typically won't see that emerge until, from my experience, July and August, but I would recommend that you go ahead and treat now with something like mancozeb, for example, as well as a systemic like Cleary's. You could also use something like Daconil as well, which is just a topical spray, but it takes care of about, I believe, 65 diseases. So it's kind of a good catch-all. And again, all of this information is on that PDF down below. All right, now in regards to pruning and wiring in the spring, I would recommend that you do none of that during this season. We want the candle growth to extend in the spring so that it's very strong come decandling time in the summer. So I don't recommend that you prune at this time of year. I wouldn't recommend that you needle pluck at this time of year either. That should be done in the previous fall, which we're going to cover later in this video. And then when it comes to wiring, this is a terrible time of year as well to do wiring because, again, it's going to weaken the tree, number one, and number two, you could potentially knock off the new candles that are emerging at this time of year. So basically, pruning and styling wise, I would do nothing in the spring season.